Nightfall settled gently over the waters of the Mediterranean. The sea moved slowly, brushing against the curved hulls of anchored ships, each one swaying with the rhythm of centuries. The water carried a cool weight, ancient, timeless, as though every wave still remembered the stories of empires long since turned to dust. Above, the sky deepened from gold to violet, then to a shade of blue so dark it bordered on black. The final breath of sunset flickered on the horizon, clinging to the edges of far-off cliffs before surrendering to night. A single star blinked to life. Then another. Then many. The sky, once ablaze with light, now shimmered with quiet. And far ahead, resting along the curve of the coast, the city of Carthage began to glow. Not with the chaos of fire. Not with the thunder of war. But with something older, softer. It shimmered with stillness, as if carved from shadow and torchlight, a city asleep beneath the weight of its own history. White walls and sandstone towers emerged from the gloom, kissed by the first touch of moonlight. The outlines of temples crowned the higher ridges. Ships moored to long stone arms stretching into the sea, rocked gently, their sails furled and still. Carthage did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a scroll being unrolled in careful hands. A lone traveler approached from the water, seated in a narrow wooden boat, oars dipping silently into the tide. No greetings were exchanged. No guards hailed them. The harbor had no need for fanfare. This was a city that had seen 1,000 travelers before and would see 1,000 more. A place that did not welcome or refuse, only endured. The creak of wood echoed softly as the boat drew closer. Each stroke of the oar lifted silver ribbons from the sea. Fish darted beneath the hull, brief flickers of movement in the otherwise still water. The smell of the coast grew richer with every breath, a blend of salt, myrrh, and distant citrus groves. Somewhere, the faintest whiff of crushed olives drifted on the wind. Above the harbor, rooftops disappeared into layered shadows. Terraces jutted over alleyways like balconies into silence. Between buildings, the warm orange glow of lanterns flickered, not many, just enough to shape the night. The light was not meant to guide but to comfort. The boat bumped gently against the edge of a stone dock, its surface worn smooth by centuries of hands and footsteps, by cargo unloaded, by voices bartering in dozens of languages. Phoenician, Greek, Berber, Latin, Egyptian. Each had touched this place, left something behind, and vanished. The travelers stepped ashore. Their sandals met stone, still holding the warmth of the sun, though the air had cooled. Overhead, a seagull cried once, startled by nothing, and vanished into the dark. To the left, carved into the walls of the dock, ancient symbols lingered. Faded by salt and time, they marked the presence of gods long since gone quiet. Tanit, Melkart, Balhaman. Their names no longer spoken aloud, but still etched in the bones of the city. A lantern burned low at the harbor's edge, its wick barely alive. The flame danced softly in the breeze, casting gold across the lapping water. Its reflection shimmered on the polished hull of a moored merchant vessel, rocking gently in its berth. The city loomed ahead, not in menace, but in memory. Its silence was not emptiness, it was reverence. Stone steps led upward from the harbor into the heart of Carthage. They had been walked by merchants returning from Greece, by soldiers returning from Sicily, by priests wrapped in linen robes, heads bowed in prayer. They were not grand. They were worn. They were real. The traveler climbed slowly, passing a sleeping mule tied to a post. It did not stir. The scent of dried hay and seaweed surrounded it. A pair of clay amphorae leaned against the wall beside it, their mouths sealed with wax and stamped with the seal of a fish. As the traveler ascended, the city began to breathe. Not loudly, not with music or chatter, but with the hum of life beneath rest. A gentle cough behind a shutter. The soft patter of a stray cat slipping down a narrow passage. The muted sound of water pouring into a basin from a still-flowing fountain. The higher they climbed, the more the city revealed itself. A place not defined by its buildings or wealth, but by its endurance. Carthage had fallen once, burned under Roman siege, but it had risen again, rebuilt, reinvented. It stood now not as a monument to conquest, but as a memory made solid. From the upper terraces, the harbor looked like a pool of ink, still, dark, ringed in amber. Ships slept there like creatures in hibernation. Their masts pointed to the stars, silent prayers in wood and sail. The traveler paused to breathe, to listen. The wind shifted again, warm against the face. It carried whispers from the sea waves breaking on distant stones, the call of a lone owl, and beneath it all, the ancient sound of a city that no longer needed to prove itself. It simply existed, and tonight, it slept. The path from the harbor curved gently uphill, winding through the first outer layers of the city, a threshold between sea and stone, between trade and tradition. This was not the heart of Carthage, but its breath, a place where the rhythm of daily life lingered long after the sun had fallen. The road was paved with pale, time-smoothed stone. Narrow gutters traced its edges, collecting runoff from earlier in the day. In places, the grooves were worn deep, polished by the footsteps of generations. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, potters. Lives lived and passed like clouds, each leaving a faint imprint on the city beneath. Carthage did not rise with violence or spectacle, but unfolded gently district by district, each one tucked into the next like the layers of a well-woven tapestry. The traveler moved through this unfolding slowly. Their steps echoed softly as they passed through a shaded archway into the outer market, a place that had been busy hours before but now rested in a gentle hush. Stalls stood empty now, their awnings tied back and their goods packed away. But traces remained, a few baskets left in corners, empty spice sacks stacked in piles, stray lentils scattered across wooden tables. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting slow-moving shadows across the ground. The light was warm, flickering with every breeze, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. Their golden glow reflected in windows covered with latticework, in the brass bowls left soaking in basins, in the metal buckles of a forgotten sandal beside a merchant bench. A few vendors lingered, finishing their final tasks with practiced patience. One old man folded bolts of dyed cloth, ochre, crimson, lapis blue, and tied them into bundles with linen rope. Another carefully stacked clay cups into a crate, pausing to wipe his forehead with a stained sleeve. A spice seller, broad-backed and wrapped in a woven shawl, hummed a slow tune as he sorted dried coriander pods into clay bowls. His movements were steady, almost ritualistic. From his corner came the mingled scents of turmeric, cumin, and a trace of dried rose petals, aromas that did not shout, but whispered. Nearby, a child gathered figs that had fallen from a tilted cart, placing each one gently into a basket. He worked in silence, barefoot on warm stone, his eyes half closed with sleep. When the last fruit was collected, he sat beside the cart, resting his chin on his knees, blinking up at the darkening sky. In the distance, a lyre played softly. The notes were slow and slightly uneven, like a lullaby remembered from long ago. They floated through the market from behind a shuttered doorway, weaving between pillars and pots, between drying herbs and hanging wind chimes. Stone pavements still radiated the heat of the day, a quiet warmth that clung to the soles of the traveler's sandals. The air, now cooled by twilight, carried layers of scent. Grilled lentils, pressed olive oil, baked barley, the sharp tang of vinegar, and the woody perfume of sandalwood oil. These were not the smells of spectacle. They were the smells of life, of sleep approaching. The traveler passed under a low colonnade where pigeons cooed softly, their wings fluttering as they settled onto the rafters for the night. One of them, younger than the rest, tilted its head at the stranger before tucking its beak beneath its wing. On one wall, a worn mural depicted a caravan arriving from the desert. Camels with bronze bells around their necks, merchants holding bolts of fabric, trays of turquoise, baskets of dates. Time had faded the colors, but not the memory. The city still remembered. Even its walls carried dreams. As the traveler moved forward, they noticed the market's texture changing, the rougher stone of the lower street giving way to polished tile. Here, wealth had a quieter face. No gold or gems, but balance. Clean lines. A harmony of angles and arches. Pots of lavender sat near doorways. Clay jars filled with citrus leaves cooled in shadowed alcoves. A fig tree leaned over the street, its branches heavy with fruit. A pair of cats sat beneath it, one grooming the other. When the traveler passed, they looked up but did not move. Carthaginian cats did not fear strangers. They belonged to the city as much as the walls, the water, the wind. Further ahead, a narrow passage led between two buildings. It was barely wider than a doorway, but even here, life hummed. A woman stood beside a steaming pot, stirring with a long wooden ladle. The scent of lentil stew drifted into the traveler's path, rich with garlic and a hint of mint. She did not look up, but her lips moved, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in songs. A wind passed through the market, lifting a loose scrap of linen from a bench. It drifted gently through the air before landing on a bed of moss near a well. The well itself was carved with symbols, spirals, sunbursts, the image of a sailing vessel, and its bucket swayed in the breeze. From the far end of the square, a candle flickered behind colored glass. It painted soft patterns on the wall beside it, blues, ambers, and deep greens swirling like ocean currents. It was the last shop still open, a seller of perfumes. Inside, a woman wrapped a small vial in wool and placed it in a clay urn for a customer whose voice was too quiet to carry. The traveler paused here, letting the stillness settle into their shoulders. Carthage did not hurry. It did not impress with size, but with rhythm, a slow, enduring beat that flowed from breath to breath, from footstep to footstep, from light to shadow. The outer market, now folded into itself like a book closed for the night, exhaled its last sigh. Somewhere behind a shuttered door, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a lullaby began. Far above, the stars blinked patiently over the rooftops. And between them all, the traveler walked unseen, a witness to a city not performing but being, alive and resting. The traveler moved away from the resting marketplace, following a wide, tree-lined street that gently curved along the edge of a rising hill. Here, the city began to change. The buzz of commerce, even at its quietest, fell away entirely, replaced by stillness. This was the district of the well-to-do, those whose fortunes had been made not by war, but by grain, dye, salt, and silk. Merchants and ship owners. Scribes. Traders whose goods had traveled further than they ever would themselves. The buildings stood taller here, though not boastful. Each villa was modestly proud, painted in faded reds and soft ochres, framed by columns that supported small balconies hung with linen drapes. Iron lanterns swung gently at each doorway, casting looping shadows across cobblestones. Some entrances were closed. Others lay half open, revealing little more than warm interior light and the glint of brassware set upon low tables. It was in front of one such home, tucked beneath the arching branches of a mature olive tree, that the traveler stopped. The home was not large, but it breathed comfort. A stone threshold worn smooth by decades of sandals. A low fountain beside the door, its waters catching starlight. The faint scent of rosemary and burnt cedar. The wooden door stood ajar. Inside, the glow of torches reached outward in welcome, their flames licking gently within iron sconces mounted on plastered walls. The sound of water came from deeper within, not rushing, but trickling like a song played only for the patient. The traveler stepped inside. Stone tiles covered the floor, arranged in wide, looping mosaics. Small dolphins. Spirals. Branches heavy with pomegranates. The artistry was subtle, the colors muted, ochre, charcoal, ivory, and a pale ocean blue. The air within the villa was cooler than the street outside, not cold, but tranquil, the breath of stone and still water. A shallow rectangular pool dominated the central atrium. Moonlight streamed through the open ceiling above, reflecting across the surface of the water. There were no ripples, only stillness. Clay amphorae lined the walls, each sealed and marked. One bore the painted symbol of a fish. Another, the branching crown of a palm. A third bore only a word, now faded beyond recognition. The room whispered, not with voices, but with memory. The creak of ceiling beams. The tap of water against copper. The low, steady hum of crickets beyond the walls. From an adjoining room came the sound of gentle conversation. Two women, perhaps sisters, perhaps a mother and daughter, folded cloth by lamplight. Their hands moved in quiet rhythm, folding, smoothing, stacking. One of them laughed softly at something the other said, but the sound barely echoed beyond their corner of the villa. Across the way, an elderly man sat beside a brazier, a scroll unrolled in his lap. He read aloud in a slow, deliberate voice, not for others, but for the joy of hearing the language again. Phoenician, ancient, melodic, and alive only in places like this. Each word he spoke felt like it had roots. Deep ones. Words that had passed through the mouths of sailors, kings, scholars, and poets. He paused often, sipping from a cup of cooled tea, occasionally adjusting the weight of the scroll between thumb and forefinger. Beside him, a girl lay sleeping. She was no more than 6 years old, curled on a thick mat, her head resting on a small pillow embroidered with pomegranate flowers. One arm was wrapped around a carved lion, a toy smoothed by years of holding. Its wooden paws were glossy and one ear was chipped. But it was loved. The firelight played gently across her face. Near the open doorway to the garden, a tabby cat stretched its legs, gave a soft, tired yawn, and nestled against the cool tile beside a low clay bowl of milk. It watched the traveler for a moment with slow blinking eyes, then returned to its sleep. The traveler lingered, not moving, not intruding, simply breathing in the calm of a place at rest, a room that spoke not in sentences, but in textures. The elder continued his reading. At one point, he turned to the girl, even though she was asleep, and finished a sentence as if it were for her alone. His voice softened, no longer the rhythm of recital, but the lull of memory. Then he set the scroll aside, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. From the garden came the sound of moving leaves. The faint perfume of night jasmine floated into the villa, carried on a breeze so delicate it barely disturbed the hanging cloth between rooms. Outside, the city pulsed quietly. Other homes, other rooms, other fathers reading to sleeping daughters. Other elders kneeling in prayer. Other cats resting near braziers. The city, vast and old, had narrowed itself down to this one moment. This one room. This one breath. The traveler stepped back into the courtyard, letting the door close gently behind them, and Carthage sighed once more. The scent of salt lingered in the night air. Down the sloping avenues from the upper quarters of Carthage, the cobbled streets descended toward the harbor district. Here, the sea met stone and Carthage breathed through her ships. A cluster of torches danced by the water's edge, their flames flickering against the polished hulls of merchant vessels and warships alike. The two harbors, the Carthage of commerce and the inner naval basin, lay quiet under the stars, their crescent shapes carved into the coast like twin silver bowls. In the commercial harbor, stevedores moved slowly under the weight of amphorae filled with Numidian olives, Egyptian papyrus, and Iberian silver. They spoke in hushed voices, respectful of the dark, of the gods, or perhaps of the sea itself. Nearby, a Phoenician sailor strummed a lyre softly, his voice rising and falling with a lullaby from Tyre, an echo from Carthage's ancient mother. Stone columns framed the entrance to the naval harbor where the city's famous round dock stood in eerie stillness. Once by day, the air rang with hammering and the creak of cranes lifting timber into place, but now only the murmur of the tide brushed the blackened keels of the triremes. These warships rested like lions at sleep, lean and sleek, with rows of oars tucked away like folded wings. Each bore the city's sigil carved into its prow, a raised palm tree or the head of Balhaman. Above, from a balcony overlooking the shipyards, a magistrate wrapped in a deep blue robe watched silently. He had spent decades among scrolls and contracts, calculating grain shipments and naval budgets. Yet tonight, he did not think of numbers. His eyes were drawn to the horizon. Somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the Mediterranean's embrace, lay Rome. Carthage had sent envoys there, traders and generals. But the sea held its own memory. In its depths, it remembered battles and truces. It remembered the tides of politics, the clash of iron, and the silence after storms. A young boy darted along the stone quay, barefoot and quick, chasing the glow of a firefly. His laughter rang out once, then vanished like mist. His father called softly from the fishing skiff anchored nearby, hauling in the day's final net. It was light, few fish had come tonight. But the man smiled anyway, casting a glance up at the constellations above. The sky over Carthage was vast, uncluttered, ancient, and filled with stories. Sirius twinkled above the horizon, the same star once used by Tyrian sailors centuries ago to guide their journeys westward. The same star that had perhaps led Alyssa Dido to this very shore. The same star that now watched over her city. A priest passed along the edge of the harbor, dressed in linen and gold thread, carrying a bronze censer from which incense curled. He paused to touch the prow of a vessel and offering a blessing. The harbor, after all, was sacred. The moon crept higher, casting a shimmering pathway across the water, leading out into the endless blue. Ships bound for Etruria, for Malta, for Cyrene, and beyond, each one was a thread in Carthage's web, and the harbor was her heart. And now, in the hush of the fourth watch of the night, the city breathed deeply once more. The streets of the market district lay mostly silent beneath the soft starlight. Yet even in this hour, when most homes were shuttered and courtyards quiet, a faint stir lingered in the air. A flicker of torchlight behind a silk-curtained archway. A murmur of voices within a wine merchant's shop still open to favored guests. Carthage, even in slumber, whispered in many tongues. Along the winding alleys between the main square and the northeast quarter, spice hung heavy in the warm air. Sacks of cinnamon bark from Arabia, peppercorns from India, and saffron from Cyrene had been piled high earlier in the day, their smells now seeping into the cool stones and woodwork. The merchants were gone, but their goods remained, watched over by hired guards who leaned against door frames, their spears resting beside them like companions from long marches. One man hummed an old Berber tune as he paced his post, slow and content. Above him, a small oil lamp swayed on a chain, illuminating a painted sign, House of Sidonian Perfumes. Across the lane, a bakery's hearth still glowed dimly. The baker's wife had risen early, or perhaps never slept, kneading dough for the first loaves of the day. In her quiet kitchen, under the stars and with her sleeves dusted in flour, she whispered a prayer to Tanit for health and for trade. The silence was not emptiness, it was depth. It was a silence shaped by centuries. A stray cat padded across the stones, passing beneath a colonnade carved with lotus motifs and Punic inscriptions. From a shadowed doorway, a scholar in a woolen robe emerged, clutching a clay tablet. He was old, his beard long and gray, and his eyes tired from reading. Earlier in the evening, he had been among a gathering of elders, debating the writings of the Greek logographers. Herodotus, they said, did not understand Carthage. His words were tinted with the misunderstanding of foreigners. But tonight, there were no debates, only the night sky and the rustling of papyrus in his hand. Past the far end of the market stood a statue, barely visible now, but known to all, a woman robed in flowing drapery, her arms open, her gaze cast outward toward the east. It was Dido, Elissa, founder of the city. At her feet were offerings, small carved elephants, a scattering of coins, a folded note in child's handwriting. Some still came at midnight to thank her. 2 Greek traders wrapped in traveling cloaks passed the statue slowly, their sandals crunching over the gravel. They spoke of tomorrow's ship to Sicily, of whether the harbor winds would favor their journey. Their tone was low, respectful. Carthage was not like other ports. It had weight, presence. Even silence felt watched over here. And beyond them, deeper into the web of streets, someone played a flute. Soft, wavering notes. Not from a performance stage, but a private window. A girl, perhaps, or an old man who could not sleep. The tune wandered across the rooftops like a gentle breeze. It brought with it memories of markets at dawn, of mothers calling children, of laughter under date palms. Memories of Carthage's day drifting gently into its night. The city did not sleep all at once. It dozed in layers, some hearts still awake, some dreams still forming. And the market streets, with all their mingled voices and wares, now rested beneath the cloak of stars, waiting for the sun to rise again. High above the quiet streets and lamplit homes of Carthage, where the air became thin and cool and the sounds of commerce faded to memory, rose the slopes of Bursa Hill. It was from here that the ancient city had once been born, laid out in concentric rings, the sacred mound at its heart. And at its crown, near the oldest walls and the oldest stones, stood the temple of Tanit, the silent guardian of the city, the sacred flame that had burned through centuries. Night had deepened. The stars above hung low and clear, vast in their procession across the dark sky. The full curve of the Milky Way traced a luminous arc above the temple, the same stars that had guided ships from Tyre, that had watched over Dido, that had borne witness to 1,000 quiet prayers. The night wind, cool and scented with salt, moved through the cypress and myrtle trees planted at the temple's edge. It rustled leaves, carried ash, and brought with it the distant murmur of waves crashing against the harbors far below. The temple itself was modest in height but powerful in presence. Hewn from golden stone that caught the moonlight and reflected it like bone, the structure was as old as the city, older even than many believed. Its columns were fluted with Phoenician motifs, lotus blossoms, palm fronds, and suns etched in relief. Time had worn them smooth, but the symbols still breathed with quiet power. Inside the outer gate, the courtyard of offerings stretched before the sanctum. Low braziers flickered at regular intervals, casting rings of amber light on the tiled floor. The tiles were laid in ancient mosaic, depicting the goddess in many forms, sometimes as a robed woman with arms raised, sometimes as a disc flanked by crescent horns, and sometimes only as a sacred triangle. Beneath these images, pilgrims had walked barefoot for centuries, their footsteps wearing the stone smooth. Now, at this sacred hour, long past midnight, a silent procession was underway. A line of priestesses robed in white with indigo hems moved through the courtyard. Each held a lamp made of polished bronze, the flame protected by glass shaped like a lotus bud. Their faces were solemn, calm. They moved slowly with the deliberate grace of those performing something not for spectacle, but for eternity. In their midst, an older priestess led the way, her robe threaded with gold, her head encircled by a silver band inlaid with lapis. She was the High Keeper of Tanit, known not by personal name but by her title alone. She had held this post for decades, her life given over to service of the Divine Mother of Carthage. It was said she no longer dreamed as others did, for Tanit had given her visions, and in dreams she walked not among men but among stars and stone lions. As they moved, the faint sound of chanting began. It was not in Punic alone, it was a blending, a layering of Phoenician, Berber, and the ancient tongues of the sea. The chant did not rise, it descended like a mist. It wrapped around the temple columns and drifted across the courtyard tiles, carried into the night like incense. From within the inner sanctum, the statue of Tanit looked outward through an open doorway. She was not a goddess of wrath or fury. She was not adorned with weaponry or chains. Her form was graceful, seated, carved from black basalt. Her hands were extended, one palm open, one held over her chest. Her eyes, inlaid with pale stone, seemed to hold the moon itself in their reflection. A golden sun disk crowned her head. Around the base of the statue were the offerings of the day, garlands of pressed flowers, small ivory combs, copper rings, a robe folded 3 times with its hem stitched in Tyrian purple. Each item whispered a story of love hoped for, of children protected, of ships blessed before long journeys. A young girl, perhaps 12, stood near the sanctum's entrance. Her robe was plain. Her sandals were too large. She held a shallow clay bowl filled with crushed lavender and sacred oil. It was her first vigil. Her eyes, wide and awestruck, stared at the goddess as if she might move, might breathe, might speak. The High Keeper nodded to her gently, a sign of welcome. The girl stepped forward. She moved with care, approaching the central brazier in the temple's heart. The coals within had burned since dusk, tended hourly, never left alone. As the girl reached the basin, she tipped the bowl. The oil poured slowly, catching flame. A small flare rose, bright blue, then golden orange. In the light, the girl's face glowed. Behind her, the chant continued, now rising slightly in cadence. A second layer of harmony joined. A deeper voice, male, from the small circle of acolytes standing near the temple's eastern arch. Though men were not usually part of Tanit's inner rites, they were welcomed in this hour, when the city itself became sacred, and all boundaries blurred under the weight of stars. Beyond the temple walls, the city watched in silence. Below, the harbor lights twinkled like spilled jewels on the water. The hills beyond the city, olive groves, date palms, villas, and gardens, were lost to darkness, but the roads that threaded them were still faintly visible under moonlight. A lone soldier, just returned from duty near the Numidian frontier, made his way quietly along the upper path. His armor clinked softly, dusty from weeks of travel. At his belt was a small parcel, wrapped in worn linen. He paused at the temple gate, bowed his head, and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a small lion, carved from desert stone, its mane stylized, its body marked with a sunburst. It had been given to him by a wandering trader, who claimed it brought courage. The soldier had survived the campaign. He had seen comrades fall. He had crossed dunes that stretched like oceans. Now he knelt and placed the lion at the base of the temple wall. No words were spoken, but his eyes, glistening in the firelight, said enough. Inside, the vigil reached its peak. The High Keeper raised her hands, palms facing outward. The chant stopped. Silence fell. Not heavy, not sudden, but like a held breath. In that moment, the wind passed once more through the cypress trees, and the firelight flickered across the mosaics on the floor. The keeper lowered her arms. Then, from the back of the temple, a group of veiled women entered, the dream singers. These were not priestesses in the ordinary sense. They were women who claimed to speak the dreams of the goddess, to receive visions during night trance. Once a month, during the dark moon, they were summoned to sing. They took their places near the sanctum and began to hum, low and resonant. No lyrics, only tone. The sound was haunting, deep, vibrating in the bones of the temple itself. It was a music that spoke not to ears, but to memory. It echoed with the weight of cities lost beneath sand, with ships sunk beyond the horizon, with names whispered on deathbeds. And in their music something stirred. A wind rose, soft but insistent. The flames trembled. A statue's shadow flickered against the far wall, and for one breathless second, the girl at the brazier felt something. A warmth not from fire, presence not seen but known. Tanit had heard. The moment passed. The music faded. The lamps dimmed. The priestesses bowed low and filed slowly into the inner chambers to complete the rites in silence. The temple returned to stillness, the air now heavier with meaning, with memory. Outside, the soldier had gone. In his place, a cat now slept curled against the stone lion he had left, its tail flicking lazily in its dreams. Above, the stars still turned, untouched by human worry, unchanged by the flicker of time. And beneath them, high upon Bursa Hill, the temple of Tanit stood watch. Unmoved, unbroken, unseen by most, yet always felt. The city slept now in full. No more carts echoed through the alleys. No more fishermen pulled their nets. But in this sacred place, fire still burned, prayers still floated on the breeze, and a goddess watched over the city that dared to challenge empires. Carthage had many walls, many harbors, many coins stamped with kings. But this temple, this quiet circle of flame and stone, was her true heart. And it beat on in rhythm with the sea. The moon had climbed high above Carthage now, casting a pale glow over the rooftops and temple spires. The stars had shifted in their celestial paths, and across the hills that surrounded the city, the scent of citrus blossoms, jasmine, and warm earth filled the air. On the eastern slope of Bursa, nestled beneath the watchful gaze of the temple and rising above the lower city, stood the villas of the Carthaginian elite. These were no mere dwellings, they were small worlds unto themselves, built with quiet grandeur, walled gardens, and mosaics that whispered of empire and ancestry. By this hour, most windows glowed no more. The shutters had been drawn. The slaves had retreated to their quarters. The courtyards were silent, except for the rustle of wind through fig trees and the occasional murmur of a sleeping dove. Yet within one such villa, its doorway framed by palm leaves and lion carvings, life still lingered. The house of Saphonides. A nobleman. A judge. A man of letters. He was not known for military conquests or grand voyages, but for something far subtler, his wisdom. His opinions were sought at the highest levels of Carthage's council, and his household was famed for its library, for the scrolls and tablets that filled the inner rooms with the scent of old papyrus and cedar oil. Tonight, the judge sat awake by a low bronze lamp, its light casting elongated shadows across the wall. His robe was simple, undyed linen, belted with a thin strip of leather. A cup of warm fig wine rested by his side, untouched. He was not reading now, though the scroll in his lap bore the marks of a Greek scribe, Plato, perhaps, or Solon. Instead, his gaze drifted outward. He sat in the peristyle, a columned open-air courtyard at the heart of his villa. In its center, a shallow reflecting pool glimmered faintly in the starlight. Around it, the tiled floor depicted a great naval scene, ships with sails unfurled, dolphins leaping beside their keels, Poseidon watching from the depths. The judge had commissioned it in his youth. Now he studied it not as a work of art, but as a mirror of time past. Footsteps approached barefoot quiet. It was his youngest daughter, Arishta, no more than 12. She wore a light tunic and rubbed sleep from her eyes. She had always struggled with the night, drawn to stars, to quiet things, to questions. "Why are you awake, father?" she asked gently, curling beside him on a low stool. He smiled but did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed upward to Orion, now climbing above the rooftops. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when your mother and I watched that constellation from the deck of a ship near Thapsus. The sky was so clear we thought we could climb into it." Arishta listened, half dreaming. She liked when her father spoke of stars. Unlike the other children, she found comfort not in tales of battles, but in maps of the heavens, in the stories behind the constellations. "Is it true," she whispered, "that Orion was a hunter?" He nodded. "A great one, but also proud. The gods placed him in the sky to remember his strength and his mistakes." A silence passed between them. From the garden beyond the columns, the sound of wind chimes drifted in. Made of bronze and ivory, they had been hung by Phoenician craftsmen years ago. They sang only when the wind came from the east, from over the sea. Tonight, the notes were soft and irregular, like a lullaby for an unseen child. Arishta yawned, curling into her father's side. He wrapped an arm around her gently and continued in a low voice. You see, my daughter, this house is only wood and stone. But what it holds, your thoughts, your learning, your dreams, those are what make it truly Carthaginian. She mumbled something about writing a poem and drifted to sleep. The judge watched her breathe, her chest rising and falling with the same rhythm as the sea beyond the hill. Then, with slow care, he rose, wrapped her in a shawl, and carried her to her chamber. As he passed beneath a painted lintel, he looked once at the fresco above, a woman in blue robes walking between lions. It was Alyssa, Dido, the founder, the queen. She had built this city on her own terms. She too must have watched her people sleep. He placed Arishta gently onto her bed of woven reeds and linen, kissed her brow, and whispered a prayer, to Tanit, to the ancestors, to the endless SKT. Then he returned to the peristyle, where the lamp still burned. From another wing of the house came the soft shuffling of sandals. Yehomilki, the old house steward, appeared with a thin blanket draped over one shoulder and a clay oil pot in his hand. My lord, shall I extinguish the flame? The judge nodded. Yes, let the house sleep. Yehomilki bowed and moved to pour the oil, but hesitated. Will you dream, my lord? The judge smiled faintly. I always dream, sometimes of ships, sometimes of fire, sometimes of silence. And with that, the flame was snuffed. But the house did not fall into darkness. The starlight was enough. Outside the villa walls, the neighborhood sloped gently downward toward the terraces of other noble homes, each hidden behind flowering hedges and carved wooden doors. In one home, a pair of lovers whispered good night under a fig tree. In another, a scholar lay sprawled over an open scroll, dreaming of numbers that danced like waves. In a villa at the far end of the ridge, a healer stirred herbs in a ceramic bowl, humming a lullaby that her grandmother had sung entire years before the family had crossed the sea to settle here. The wealth of Carthage was not only in its gold, its ivory, or its ships. It was here, in the quiet moments when fathers spoke of stars, when daughters dreamed of poems, when old stewards poured oil and remembered the faces of those long gone. The villas of the hill, so often written about in foreign scrolls as places of arrogance and decadence, were in truth places of humanity. They were quiet worlds of olive trees and philosophy, of ancestral masks hanging on plaster walls, of memory and meaning passed down in candlelight. And even now, long after midnight, the city spirit whispered through these homes. In one garden, a marble basin caught the moonlight just so, sending a glimmer of silver across the path. A lizard, cold and still, watched from beneath a pomegranate bush. The air was thick with the scent of chamomile and warm soil. Far below, the occasional dog bark echoed upward from the lower quarters. But up here, in the homes of the old families, time seemed to pause. Dreams unfolded like scrolls. Silence took root. The stars moved on, and Carthage, ancient and breathing, slept a little deeper. Beneath the terraces of noble villas and far below the columns of the temple district, the lower city of Carthage lay quietly nestled against the hills, its streets narrow and worn smooth by thousands of feet. This was the quarter where the city truly lived, not in gold, but in clay and linen, in spice and sweat, in laughter and lullabies. Here, homes were simpler, built of sun-baked bricks and thick stone to hold in the day's warmth, each dwelling pressed close to the next, like cupped hands. The streets between them were little more than winding alleys, some barely wide enough for a donkey cart to pass. But they were rich with the scent of life, of meals shared, of incense burned for protection, of olive oil simmering over embers and laundered tunics drying in the wind. At this hour, well past midnight, most windows were dark. Only a few flickered with oil lamps or the red glow of dying coals. A hush had settled, not dead silence, but a living quiet, like the stillness in a resting heart. From one small house, the muffled sound of a baby's breathing could be heard. The child, swaddled in woven wool, slept in a cradle made from driftwood. Beside him, his mother, a potter's wife, dozed with her hand on his chest. Her fingers were still stained with traces of red clay. Earlier that day, she had shaped tiny votive figures of Tanit for sale at the next market. Now she dreamed of fields she had never seen, of wheat that whispered, of rivers her ancestors once crossed. Her husband, curled beside the hearth, stirred in his sleep. He mumbled something, a name, a price, a line of a prayer, and then fell quiet again. A soft creak came from the roof above, where olive branches tied for shade shifted in the sea breeze. The neighbors, a weaver and his sons, had also settled for the night. They lived in a narrow house of 2 rooms stacked like boxes, and the looms, tall and made of figwood, stood silent now in the lower room. The eldest son, only 17, lay awake beneath a rough wool blanket. His hands were raw from winding thread all day, but his eyes watched the ceiling. He wasn't thinking about wool. He was thinking about the sea. About leaving. He'd heard from a friend of a shipmaster who needed an extra rower. It wouldn't pay much, but it would take him past Sicily, maybe to Corinth. Maybe farther. He had never seen the open sea, not truly, not beyond the harbor, not beyond the edge of the familiar world. But in the stillness of night, he imagined waves crashing against foreign shores and the smell of strange fruit in distant markets. Above him, his younger brother snored softly, clutching a carved elephant, an old toy passed down for 3 generations. Their father, weary from hours at the loom, slept with his arms crossed, his head against a sack of carded wool. He'd once had dreams of his own. Now his only wish was for good trade and strong sons. Just outside, in a small square lined with citrus trees, a public fountain trickled softly. The water, drawn from ancient aqueducts high in the hills, ran into a simple stone basin where women had washed clothes by daylight. Now it mirrored the moon, a quiet pool reflecting a quiet sky. A stray dog lay curled beside the fountain. Thin, silent, one ear torn. It didn't bark. It only watched the shadows as if guarding the dreams of the sleeping poor. To the west of the square, the small shrine of the street mother stood in a recessed alcove lit by a single flickering flame. The shrine was not built by the state, nor the temples. It had no priestess. It belonged to the people, the market women, the bricklayers, the water sellers. At its center was a carved figure, worn smooth by time, a woman holding a child on her hip, a wreath of figs in her hand. Around her feet, offerings had been left, half a pomegranate, a bead bracelet, a folded scrap of linen. Above her, someone had scratched into the stone in old Punic. She who listens even when the gods are silent. Someone, an old woman named Danilai, knelt there now, her bones stiff, her back bent. She came every 3rd night, as she had for years, lighting a tiny cup of oil and whispering names. Some were alive. Some were not. Her husband had died in a storm off Sardinia. Her son had not returned from the last war. But she still spoke to them here. When she rose, her knees cracked softly. She kissed the statue's feet and shuffled home through the alley, guided only by memory and moonlight. Deeper into the quarter, near the tanner's lane, the smell was stronger, leather and lime, salt and smoke. But even here, in the harshest part of the district, the night brought gentleness. A young couple shared a worn blanket on the roof of their home, lying on rush mats looking at the stars. He pointed upward. "That's Melkart's hammer," he said, referencing a star pattern his father taught him. "No," she replied, "that's the seahorse. That's what my mother called it." They both smiled and agreed not to argue. The sky was large enough for 2 names. Farther down, a group of foreign workers, Numidians and Libyans, slept together in a shared courtyard, their mats aligned like spokes in a wheel. One stirred briefly and muttered in a half-dreaming tongue, then rolled over and pulled his robe tighter. Near the edge of the district, where the lower homes met the orchards of the city outskirts, a small house sat beneath an overgrown fig tree. Inside, a boy named Eshman lay awake. He listened. Not for voices. Not for footsteps. But for the sounds of the city itself. The temple bell in the distance as it rang once. The flap of a bird's wings on the tiled roof. The rustle of a palm frond scraping the wall. He was fascinated by sounds. He could imitate them perfectly. Earlier that day, he had mimicked the creak of a merchant's ox cart so precisely that even the ox turned its head. His mother had laughed. His father had shaken his head. But tonight no one was watching. So Eshman whispered to himself. Clicks and rustles, chirps and sighs. He tried to copy the wind. He nearly succeeded. Then sleep took him. All across the lower city, dreams unfurled. Some dreamed of escape. Some of peace, some of nothing at all. And within each home, no matter how humble, a small fire burned or smoldered in a clay hearth, keeping the night at bay. In Carthage, fire was sacred. Even the poorest household tended a flame. As the hours passed, and the night drew nearer to dawn, the first small signs of stirring began to return. A baker stirred from slumber, scratching his beard as he walked barefoot to his oven to stoke the embers. A rooster, confused by the stars, crowed once, then went silent. A woman in a shawl stepped into the alley to pour out water, humming softly to herself. But for most, sleep still held them gently. The city had not yet awakened, but it had shifted, turned its face slightly toward morning. And in this vast web of alleyways, homes, shrines, and quiet hearts, the soul of Carthage lived, not in conquest, not in coins, but in the shared dreams of its people. They were never named in the scrolls of history, but they were the breath beneath the marble, the hands that shaped the bricks, the voices that filled the markets, the souls that made Carthage more than a name, more than a city, more than an empire. They were Carthage, and they slept beneath the stars, beneath the temples, beneath the silence of gods and the watch of cats and dogs and trees, and they would wake again to build, to speak, to carry forward the heartbeat of a city unlike any other. Far from the bustling markets, away from the fragrant kitchens and the thunderous shipyards, nestled in a quieter corner near the northern edge of the temple district, stood a low building with whitewashed walls and thick cypress doors. It was unremarkable from the outside. No columns, no statues, no gates of bronze. Yet behind these modest walls lay one of Carthage's quietest treasures, the school of the scribes. By day, this place rang with voices, young pupils reciting lines of Punic poetry, scribes scratching lines of trade ledgers into wax tablets, philosophers debating the ethics of empire, the nature of fate, or the movements of the stars. But by night, the school became something else entirely. It became a sanctuary of thought. A single oil lamp still burned in the open courtyard. Its flame was steady, sheltered behind a panel of glass. Around it, benches had been cleared, slates brushed clean, styluses set aside. The marble water basin at the center of the court reflected the lamp's glow like a second sun. And beneath the shadows of fig trees that flanked the inner wall, two figures sat deep in quiet conversation. One was an old man, draped in a threadbare robe dyed the deep purple of Tyre. His name was Baracle, and he had taught generations of Carthaginian scribes the art of words, the power of law, the beauty of numbers, the music hidden in the rhythm of a well-carved inscription. His voice, once commanding, had grown soft with age. But when he spoke, students still listened. The other was a girl of perhaps 16. Her name was Zimra, and she was one of the few female students allowed to train in advanced philosophy. Her mind was keen, quick, curious in ways that sometimes unnerved her peers. Where others memorized, she questioned. Where others copied, she created. Tonight, she was reading aloud from a Phoenician scroll, the Meditations of Araziel, a wandering scholar who once studied with the Greeks and debated priests in Sidon. As she read, Baracle listened, nodding now and then. "You see," she said, setting the scroll gently down, Araziel speaks of the city as a mirror. He says each stone reflects a choice made by the people, and in the total reflection, the soul of a nation is seen. But isn't that dangerous? Doesn't it mean a city can reflect something false if its people believe wrongly? Baracle smiled. It does. And that is why philosophers must walk the same streets as merchants and stonemasons. She frowned. But what good is a scroll in the hands of a hungry man? He leaned back against the fig tree and looked upward. Perhaps none, he said. Or perhaps everything. A city is not fed only by grain, Zimra. It must also feed its mind, or it becomes a husk. A vessel that floats but does not steer. A silence stretched between them. The courtyard was peaceful. A breeze passed through the fig branches, stirring their leaves like the pages of an unseen book. Somewhere within the school's stone halls, a mouse scurried across a shelf of clay tablets, chasing shadows. Zimra rose and walked to the fountain, dipping her hands in the cool water. "My brother wants to be a trader," she said, her voice echoing softly in the open space. "He says Carthage will fall without silver and spice. That philosophy is wind." Baracle chuckled. "And yet the wind moves ships." She smiled, wiping her hands on her robe. Then, turning toward the open doorway that led to the archives, she paused. "May I show you something?" Baracle nodded. Zimra disappeared into the shadows, her footsteps quiet on the worn stone floor. After a moment, she returned carrying a small clay tablet, unmarked but damp with fresh wax. On it, etched with a thin stylus, was a poem she had written. Not in Punic, but in a blend of tongues, part Phoenician, part Greek, part her own invention. It read, "We are ships of flesh upon a sea of time. Our sails are thought, our anchor memory. Let the stars be our compass, and silence our harbor." Baracle read it slowly. When he looked up, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not pride exactly, not surprise. Something deeper. Something closer to relief. "You've written what I have tried to teach for 40 years, he said softly. Zimra lowered her eyes. The lamp flickered. The wind shifted. From outside the school walls came the distant sound of a horse's hooves on stone, and then silence again. Baracle set the tablet gently on the bench beside him. "I think," he said, "that it is time we copied that onto stone." Zimra blinked. "But it's not official." "It's not. It is wisdom," he interrupted. "And that is what the city must preserve." He rose with effort, his knees cracking slightly. He looked around the courtyard, at the worn tiles and faded columns, at the empty benches and the old fig trees that had stood watch over more students than anyone could remember. "This place," he said, "will not last forever. But the words written here, if we choose them carefully, might outlive us all." Zimra nodded, and the two of them stood there in silence. The sky above the school was rich with stars. The constellations shifted westward, and with them, the city turned slowly toward dawn. In another part of the school, tucked behind a modest door, the scriptorium slept, a rows of scrolls laid in alcoves arranged by subject, language, and date. Some were in Punic, others in Greek, Latin, even Egyptian. Each bore the dust of decades. Some had been copied by candlelight during sieges. Others had been smuggled from burning libraries across the sea. And in the innermost vault, protected by a curtain of linen and cedar oil, lay the great scroll of laws etched by decree of the first Sephites of Carthage. It spoke of justice, of trade, of oaths made to the gods, of treaties once drawn in salt and sealed with iron. Few had ever read it. But it was there, resting beneath the breath of night, a slumbering testament to a civilization that believed knowledge was sacred. Elsewhere in the city, the stars still glowed over slumbering homes, over flickering hearths and shuttered windows. But here, in this quiet school, in the flicker of one last flame, a girl and a teacher had spoken of ships and silence, of memory and mirrors. And the soul of Carthage, so often buried beneath empire and ambition, had stirred. It did not shout. It did not fight. It did not conquer. It whispered. And in that whisper there was wisdom. Carthage, in all her sprawling beauty, was a city of the sea, but she was also a city of walls. Massive, layered, and legendary, her fortifications stretched for more than 20 miles, encircling harbors, markets, temples, and homes in a quiet embrace of stone and strength. They were not built in a single generation, nor by a single hand. These walls were the bones of centuries, each layer, each addition, laid in response to war, to peace, to ambition. At night, these walls did not sleep. They breathed. The stones still held the warmth of the sun. The towers whispered in the wind. And atop their heights, the watchmen walked. This was the 4th night of the lunar cycle, a time considered favorable for travel and prophecy. The moon was still strong, casting silver light across the coastal plains. From the highest parapets, one could see the glint of ships far out at sea, tiny black silhouettes rocking gently under stars. At the northern gate, where the road to Utica sloped downward into vineyards and stone paths, a sentry stood still as a statue. His name was Hanno, and he had watched this gate for 15 years. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he found peace in the silence. In the rhythm of footsteps on stone. In the deep sky above his city. He leaned against a broad cedar shield, its surface etched with the stylized tree of life, the emblem of his unit. His spear rested beside it and used for years. His helmet, polished though dented, caught the moonlight. Below him, the path was empty. Even the jackals that haunted the olive groves had moved on for the night. Hanno wasn't bored. He was listening. The sea wind carried voices he would never hear in the day. It brought the song of sails creaking in distant harbors. It carried the occasional cry of seabirds lost inland. It whispered the low chant of a temple far across the city. Carthage was a city of movement, of sound, of struggle, but here, on the wall, the city became sky. Became silence. Another pair of footsteps approached. Measured. Deliberate. It was Milkatten, the younger knight commander of the Bursa sector. Unlike Hanno, he was new to the walls. His armor still bore the scent of fresh leather, and his sandals had not yet been softened by night patrols. But his eyes were alert, not anxious. "Anything?" he asked softly. "Only the wind." Hanno replied. Milkatten leaned on the parapet, looking out toward the darkness. Far below, the fishermen's piers curved like a jawline, studded with lanterns. Some boats still rocked gently, nets coiled like sleeping snakes. In the upper harbor, galleys sat anchored in precise rows, rows of iron and ore and flame. Even in peace they waited. The city sleeps, Milkatten murmured, but she dreams in weapons. Hanno smiled. She dreams in memory. The weapons are just guardians of that memory. They stood together a while, unspeaking. Above them, the stars wheeled gently across the dome of the heavens. The North Star hung fixed, and Orion continued his march toward the horizon. A meteor streaked briefly above the mountains, then vanished. Milkatten pointed. A good omen. Hanno shrugged. Or just a reminder. Of what? That even fire falls, the older man said. For a time they said nothing more. Then Hanno reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a folded cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a carved onyx pendant. A lion with wings. A relic from his grandfather. A token of the days before Rome had ever crossed the sea. I was given this the day I joined the wall, he said. Told it was carved from stone near the pillars of Heracles. Whether that's true, I don't know. But I keep it. Milkatten studied it quietly. To remind you? To belong, Hanno said simply. Out here, you need to remember what you're guarding. Not just stone, but everything within it. He rewrapped the pendant and returned it to his belt. Behind them, from within the tower, the sound of a small bronze bell rang once, soft, high-pitched. A signal. Not alarm. Just the hour before the final watch change. From towers all around the city, other bells answered in harmony. Near the Carthage, the circular naval harbor, a gatekeeper echoed the tone with a shell horn. From the agricultural terraces, a night farmer chimed a clay bell hung beside his stable. In the hill district, a sleepy priest tapped a copper rod against the rim of a water clock. And slowly, across Carthage, the guardians of the night stirred for their final vigil before the dawn. In the southern watchtower, a woman in armor adjusted the clasp of her cloak. Her name was Tanitzaba, named for the goddess herself. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and descended from a long line of archers who had once defended Carthage against Greek pirates. She walked the full circuit of her tower's rooftop, stopping at each corner to check the signal lanterns. Her falcon, Sidi, perched silently beside her. At night, the bird did not fly, but he watched. His yellow eyes never closed. Tanitzaba paused to scan the plain to the south. The desert winds had brought a light mist that shimmered under moonlight. Somewhere out there were roads, caravans, perhaps the shadow of nomadic camps. She wasn't looking for danger. She was listening for rhythm. She touched the hilt of her dagger, whispered a word in Old Punic, and moved on. Elsewhere, a boy no older than 14 climbed the ladder to the harbor beacon, replacing the olive oil in the flame bowl. He was an apprentice, given the task as part of his first training year. He worked quickly, precisely. Once the flame caught, he sat beside it and looked out over the curved mouth of the sea. The sky was starting to shift, just a shade, just a breath. Not light, not yet. But the color of night was no longer black. It was becoming blue. Deep, ancient blue. He smiled. This was his favorite moment. When the dark began to loosen, like a robe falling gently from the world's shoulders. And still Carthage slept. And still the walls held firm. In one of the oldest watchhouses, set into the corner of the ancient Punic quarter, an elder captain sat cross-legged beside a brazier, slowly turning pages of a worn leather ledger. Each page bore the names of guards long gone, dates, notes, the time of their deaths or promotions or disappearances. On the final page, only one entry remained unwritten, the captain's own. He stared at the blank space for a long while. Then, slowly, he reached for a reed pen. He did not fill in the date, only the phrase, "The wall is the skin of the city. The skin remembers everything." The final watch neared. And so the city, though still asleep, prepared in silence for the coming light. Ships creaked on their ropes. Lamps burned lower in the temples. Dogs stretched in the alleys. A breeze carried the first hint of salt and gold, the scent of dawn, borne over the sea. And on every height, from tower to gate, From port to plain, the guardians of Carthage kept their silent promise. To stand between dream and danger. To watch even when unseen. To protect the bones and soul of a city that challenged empires, and still stood proud beneath the stars. It is not night, not truly. Yet neither is it day. It is a threshold, a fragile breath between what has been and what will be. And across the sleeping stones of Carthage, this sacred moment arrived gently, without heralds, without fire. Only light. A single ribbon of pale gold broke the darkness over the eastern sea. The stars did not vanish. Not yet. They softened, dimmed, becoming memories rather than flames. The moon, weary from her long watch, sank toward the horizon, her silver face now half lost in the lavender haze. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Carthage began to stir. The harbor was the first to feel it. The ships, which had rocked quietly in their berths, now shifted with purpose. Ropes creaked as the first sailors rose to check knots, to whisper greetings to one another beneath their breath. Nets were gathered. Buckets lowered. Water drawn. At a baker's hearth in the lower city, coals glowed red beneath a thick blanket of ash. A boy of 10 uncovered them, carefully adding dry fig wood, then blowing with practiced rhythm until flame returned. The smell of barley bread began to rise into the chill air. A rooster cried, not the confused shout of midnight, but a true waking call. One by one, shutters opened. In the villa of Saphonides, the old judge's steward Yehomilki lit a fresh lamp in the hall, bathing the mosaic of Poseidon's chariot in golden light. The judge himself stirred from light sleep and sat upright, blinking at the pale curtain of light beyond his courtyard. For a moment he simply watched the world being reborn. Farther down, the girl Zimra, the student of scrolls, rose from her pallet before the bell. She had slept little. Her poem still echoed in her thoughts. She whispered it again as she dressed, this time not for her teacher, but for herself. And as she stepped into the courtyard of the scriptorium, she noticed the fig leaves trembling not with wind, but with dawn. In the lower quarters, Arishta, young daughter of the noble house, tiptoed barefoot to her family's rooftop. There she sat, knees drawn up beneath her tunic, and watched as the sky bled orange behind the Bursa hill. From the top of that hill, at the temple of Eshmun, the first morning horn was sounded. Low. Deep. It rolled down the city like thunder muffled by silk. The priests moved silently through the colonnades, relighting the sacred flame with a bronze striker. One whispered a prayer in old Punic. Let the light of the gods return. Let the day remember us. The birds answered before the people did. Gulls and doves, falcons and sparrows. They rose from temple roofs, fig trees, balconies, and tower crests. 1,000 wings unfolded. 1,000 songs began again. And then, like tide to moon, the city followed. A woman unlatched her courtyard gate to gather herbs. A vendor in the market square spread a cloth and stacked pomegranates. A scribe dipped his stylus in fresh ink and whispered his morning oath. To record what is, what was, and what may yet be. The walls of Carthage, which had guarded the city all night, now stood not as sentinels, but as welcome arms opening to the horizon. The night's watch descended the towers, replaced by guards in lighter tunics, their faces fresh and open. Some paused to stretch and breathe deeply, faces turned eastward like sunflowers. Atop the southern rampart, Hanno, the old watchman, took one last look at the city before stepping down. He felt the sun touch his cheek for the first time in hours. He smiled, just barely, and whispered. She made it through again. Tanitsaba, the archer captain, watched the light reflect off her falcon's feathers as she fed him a morsel of meat. He did not eat until light returned. That, she always believed, was his own ritual. The school of scribes rang its morning chime, 3 soft notes on a bronze bowl. Zimra looked upward as the sound echoed, then descended the steps toward the archives. Her thoughts were already shaping new lines, new truths to carve. In the market stalls, the common folk greeted one another. Not with shouts, but with gestures, nods, smiles. There was no need for noise. The day had already spoken its arrival. The sea, too, turned gold. The waves lapped against the stone quays with rhythm, mirroring the heartbeat of the waking city. Fishermen unfurled sails. Gulls shrieked. Children ran barefoot down steps to watch the boats depart. And overhead, in a sky no longer black, but wide and endless, the sun lifted its first full face beyond the curve of the earth. Carthage breathed. She had crossed the night again. Not every city wakes like this. Some cities explode into mourning. Others groan. But Carthage remembered. She honored her night with silence and her dawn with breath. She did not rise in panic or fury or haste. She rose as she always had, like a queen emerging from slumber, graceful, deliberate, eternal. And though her history would one day burn, though her name would be blackened by victors and rewritten by enemies, though her children would scatter across oceans, this night, this morning, this single cycle of moonlight to sunlight would never vanish, because it had been witnessed by priests and guards, by poets and potters, by children and sages, by silence and by song. The night was over, but what it had held, the whispered prayers, the half-formed dreams, the shared bread, the steady flame, the centuries' stillness, the child's stargaze, would remain, carried forward in footsteps, in breath, in memory. And so the story ends not with triumph or defeat, but with continuance. A city breathing, a sun rising, a people still walking toward the day. Carthage, city of sea and stone, of scroll and sail, of fire once lit and never truly extinguished. She lives, not in ruins, but in the echo of nights like this, nights when the sky turned inward, and the stars leaned close, just to hear her dream,